the consequences of the embargoes and the sanctions and of course the wars. I mean, and the fact that they start to try to block the development of countries on the third world for reason. I mean, whether it's Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Vietnam, China, I don't care which one it is. I don't care what their social system is, but they make it impossible for them to develop. Whatever they do, and they may change. They may try one thing, try another, but then the US will always try to find a reason, human rights, democracy, and so on, to block that. And I found that monstrous. I just find it that when you really sit down, I mean, the latest example with Afghanistan is partly moving, but of course, they've done that for so many countries and so many places.
This is a follow-up for my earlier conversation with Professor Jean Bricmont, where we talked about some of his views in physics. Here, we talk about some of his ideas in politics, mainly focused around a book that he wrote called Humanitarian Imperialism, where we look at how imperial policies, American imperial policies, are exported around the world, and what role does the ideology of humanitarianism have to do with that. Here is my conversation with Professor Jean Bricmont. Let's talk about humanitarian imperialism. How did you end up writing that book?
Oof, how do I end up writing that book? But I've always been fairly political, let's say. I mean, very political for a physicist. I've been always very I'm not a militant. I've never been in an organization, but I've always been following. In particular, when I lived in the United States, I was very much interested in the writings of Noam Chomsky, and I've made a lot of advertisements for him in France, which was difficult because people were not open-minded to listen to him, to say the least. But yeah, I still maintain that this is a disaster, that the West is trying to justify its imperialism or its intervention through human rights. For example, okay, let's take, well, we can discuss Ukraine, but let's take Afghanistan. In 2008, there was a NATO summit in in Chicago in the United States, and Amnesty International made posters, which I can send you, telling NATO to keep up the work to improve the situation of women and girls in Afghanistan. So they were openly, that's a human rights organization, they were openly asking a military organization to help, okay? What does the military organization do? But the military organization wants to win the war. They don't want to, a priori, help girls and women. So they drop bombs, and they did for another 12 years, and then they left. And now people say, oh, the situation is catastrophic. Sure, it's catastrophic. But maybe it would have been less catastrophic if they had not intervened, and if they had not intervened by supporting the ancestors of the Taliban at the time of the so-called communist regime, which wasn't very communist, but it was at least more modern, let's say, than the Taliban, and that they wanted to overthrow at all costs, and they supported the more barbarian people whom they denounce now. So it's a total absurdity. Plus, well, that may change because there are some protests, but plus, the US government is confiscating, which is pure gangsterism, a part of the US, of the treasury of Afghanistan, of the public treasury of Afghanistan, when people are basically starving there. It's just unbelievable. You see, this is unbelievable cruelty. And all the comments I see now are about the plight of women. And there are a few women who demonstrated in Kabul, and then they are the great heroes, and we should support them, etc. What do they want to do? Do another 20 years of war? I mean, and they spend $2 trillion apparently, but with $2 trillion, you can give clean water, universal medical care, and all kinds of good things that you could do if you really want to do something humanitarian. I mean, it just seems to be the utmost perversion of the idea of the West now, that you present always the cause of the West as being human rights, and therefore nobody can challenge that because human rights is such a sacred value, and it's total hypocrisy.
Yeah, I really like the phrase you use of the Trojan horse, that the ideology is a Trojan horse for imperialist policies that are being snuck in.
Yeah, yeah. And the problem is that I don't, in that sense, I'm not like my Marxist friend, because I don't think there is really a rational, I insist on the word rational, economic motivation from the point of view of the capitalist or the ruling class for these wars, because these wars are very costly in the end. Of course, when they're costly, it's always useful for some people. For example, for the arms merchants, sometimes for the oil companies, not always, but sometimes. But they cost to the rest of society, and the big business is paying. I mean, the GAFAM, for example, I don't see what they win from the war in Afghanistan, and they don't. And of course, to touch the most delicate subject, support for Israel seems to be totally unrelated to any rational consideration from the American point of view. And so there are ideology. The ideology, to me, I mean, it's like religion in the old days, like Christianity in the old days. I mean, when people were attacking the barbarians, for example, in China or in India or somewhere, they were justifying it with Christian values, and now they replace it by humanitarian values. But that doesn't mean there is hypocrisy. But on the other hand, there is also fanaticism. Namely, people may have really believed that their Christian values had to be defended, God knows where, and then sending the Marines or sending the British troops or something. And it's not that they just cynically said, "Oh, we are going to do that because we're going to make a lot of money." No, there's a complicated mixture because between I would say fanaticism and self-interest, and the self-interest doesn't win all the time. If they were really that's something that Russell says, that if there were enlightened self-interest, then the world would be much better than it is, because they would not have this sort of what I call fanaticism that dominates the Western thought.
And I mean, you could have both. That you could have economic interests that incentivize war, but you can't use those incentives to justify war. So you need an ideological garb.
Exactly, but as I say, I mean, then once the ideology is in,
Right. It's very
the
hard to
people
get out.
may believe it. You see, and there is also there is always the problem that it's not clear that the you know the because if you're an American politician, if you're an American senator or something like that, and you are making the sort of remarks that I make, you would have the entire media against you, and you will use your your position. So of course, people, of course, then you could say, well, that's the interest of the senator or the congressperson to, say what they say, because that's the way they survive in the system. But that doesn't mean that there is an instance that rationally think about the interest of the ruling class or the capitalist class or whatever, and then decides on the foreign policy. It's all once the machine is on, once the religion is there, they have to go along with it, and it's very difficult to. I mean, Trump, for example, not that I like him, but he's he is sometimes things which are true. Like you think somebody say they kill people, and say you don't think we kill people. I mean, he says these things that nobody dares to say, and then sometimes he say, of course, he's awful once he's in power. I mean, I'm not defending him, but sometimes he has this outburst, and he gets away with it for some reason. You see, even though he's hated by the whole system, but he's still able to get away with some of what he says. But usually people go along with the ideology because that's their way to survive. So in that sense, there is their self-interest, but doesn't mean that there is a rational class interest behind these wars or these intervention and so on and so forth. But I find that I found the result. I mean, I think I give many examples in my book. It dates from 2004, but or 2005 in English. But it's really, it seems to me that if you make the list of the consequences of the embargoes and the sanctions and and of course the wars. I mean, and the fact that they start to try to block the development of countries on the third world for reason. I mean, whether it's Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Vietnam, China. I don't care which one it is. I don't care what their social system is, but they make it impossible for them to develop whatever they do, and they may change. They may try one thing, try another, but then the US will always, always, always try to find a reason, human rights, democracy, and so on, to block that. And I found that monstrous. I just find it that when you really sit down, I mean, the latest example with Afghanistan is partly moving, but of course they've done that for so many countries and so many places. Plus, of course, the coup. Because there's also one thing I mentioned in my book, which I think goes back even to the Soviet Revolution, is what I call the barricade effect. Once the US takes sanctions, and Russell was making that point when he went to Soviet Russia in 1920, is that okay? We make all these sanctions, but of course the other guys don't say, "Oh, we're going to be nice." I'm sorry. Of course they react by barricading themselves, and then of course they take repressive measures to their own population because they suspect people to be traitors, agents of the of imperialism, which sometimes they are. I mean, there is, of course, there are agents. Western agents at work in those countries. Of course, then you make mistakes, and if you then you get trapped into a sort of authoritarian model, and then the authoritarian model is used as an excuse for further sanction. And as Russell says, if somebody is thirsty and doesn't have anything to eat, he will lose its mental faculties. But that's usually not considered as a good argument to make him starve. But when it comes to nation, they think that every measure, repressive measure, is justification for more sanctions, more coup and whatever.
Right. And I mean, American imperialism is not a secret to anybody who's even poorly glanced at the history, right? And it's the history of the U.S.
Yeah, but do they teach that in American universities? I don't think so. I mean, that's where it matters. Of course, maybe if you go to India or Pakistan or I don't know, I mean, or the Middle East, I mean, the people don't need to be told what I say, but certainly in my place, I mean, that book, I mean, I know there have been people who would say, why don't you discuss it? And people say, no, we can't discuss this beyond the pale. So that's, I mean, it's a bit a curious situation that all these people claim to be rational, for example, Pinker and so on, but they I mean, all these liberals, I mean, that's one thing I don't like with American liberals is that they always claim to be the peak of rationality, but they are totally blind to that aspect of their own society.
Right. It's a very narrow view of what rationality is.
Yeah, because then they have a very sort of narrow-minded view of the market and so on and so forth. But even the market is a complicated business. I mean, market can be efficient in some situations, but maybe not in others, and it's a complicated question. And then they make some sort of simple, calculation, and then they think that's an example of rationality. But I don't think that solves the problem. It doesn't solve the problem of international relations. In fact, now I don't know what will happen with that, but not that I particularly share his viewpoint, but the last speech of Putin is really openly calling for the end of what he called globalization. But of course, I would not call it globalization, but there's a lot of people in the world who resent, the US imperialism, and they call it globalization, which is not the right concept, but there is obviously a lot of resentment in many, many countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, which has been, of course, there since the anti-colonial struggle of the last century. But there is a very strong resentment. I don't know what it will lead to because the Americans seem to be totally clueless about it. They don't like, it's like Bush. I mean, they don't like us because we are so good. No? We are so good. I mean, it's ridiculous. But I mean, a Bush, you could say, is an imbecile. But then nobody else seems to have any clue of why Americans are not liked in the rest of the world. They have an incredible hubris, and it's very dangerous because, of course, they made it's like the trip of Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan. Oh, we have the right to. Wait a minute, I mean, it's a complicated question, and the Communist Party of China doesn't have the right to decide who Nancy Pelosi where go. Well, she goes in China. It's recognized as part of China. It's recognized as part of China by the UN, by the United States. And if I go to China myself, I need a visa from the Chinese authorities. Okay, and if Taiwan is part of China, then you can't just go there if the Chinese authorities don't want me to go. It's as simple as that. And it's true if I wanted to go to, I don't know, Japan or any other country. And it just amazing that people don't seem to realize I mean, and again, this is not the fact that Taiwan is part of China is not my invention. It's something which is admitted by the U.S. government. That's the one China policy, and that's been, you know, you can change the policy. You can say, okay, but that's not what they do. They just say, oh, we have the right to go wherever we want.
Yeah, yeah. The ideology does blind you to the complexities of international relations. I mean, it's at some point you have to take a pragmatic standpoint when no matter what your view on ethics are. You have to take a serious pragmatic standpoint when you're looking at international relations in real time.
But you have to be. You see, I like de Gaulle, for example, the French leader. He was complete. Well, of course, he was putting forward the interests of France, but it's interesting that, for example, you know, he was for the decolonization of Algeria under certain conditions, maybe, but still, because he thought that it was not in the interest of France to keep Algeria as a colony, as other people on the right thought. He was on the right, if you wish, but he was an original fellow, and he certainly did not. He think it was more a weight for France, and in fact, he also, contrary to what many people on the left thought, it didn't hurt economically France. And when de Gaulle was in Phnom Penh, I think in '66, he gave a famous speech criticizing the Vietnam War, and he said to the Americans, get out of Vietnam, you will not suffer. It will not cost you economically, and it didn't cost us France to get out of Algeria. So again, I challenge the idea that this is rational economic motivation, because if you're really rational, then you would you would cooperate, and you would accept peaceful coexistence between different social systems. And de Gaulle was totally in favor of that. He had his own views. He was very anti-communist, if you wish, but nevertheless, he was realist about, the existence of China, Russia, Soviet Union, etc. And I think that's the only solution, because there is obviously no solution in this policy of constant intervention.
Yeah, and it's endless. Like Vietnam, Afghanistan,
Exactly,
Yugoslavia.
because there are human rights violations, of course, but the human rights violation everywhere. I mean, if you go say, what about Saudi Arabia? I mean, and then of course they go begging the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, for more oil because they've taken sanctions against Russia. But what Saudi Arabia waged a war in Yemen, which is certainly as cruel as what the Russians are doing in Ukraine, and then of course certainly it's more a dictatorship than Russia. So I mean, it just doesn't make. In the end, this policy leads to a infinite series of contradiction, and it's not. I maintain it's not good even in the long run for the United States. And anyway, the United States has a lot of internal problems, and you see they don't want to. I mean that's again something which I like. Well, with many nuances about Trump. I mean Trump's message is let's take care of our own problems. Now, I don't think he takes care of them well. That's another question. But the idea that you should focus on your own problem rather than going. I mean, once Biden came into office, he said, now the US is back and we are going to run the world or guide the world like the way function. No, 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 no. We don't know, thanks. We don't need a guide, okay? We don't need a guide who is not elected by us. We can't do anything about it because they decide, they say it's democratic, but what is democratic about 300 million people guiding 6 billion people? I just don't understand. And the whole thing is just, I mean, to me, it's very repulsive. It's humanly disastrous, but of course, intellectually, as a rationalist, I found it extremely, extremely irrational.
Just to play devil's advocate a little bit, from a reflection on ethics, is there any part of you that makes a concession on the other side that sees ethical standards as objective and might see that as an opportunity to, you know what I mean?
I knew you were going to ask me a question, but which is, I've not written anything about ethics in general, and I'm not a philosopher. I'm certainly not a philosopher of ethics. So I'm just a citizen. Now, if you ask me, my ethics is basically consequentialist or utilitarian. I don't take principles. I don't like a priori principles like human rights. Of course, we're all for human rights, but the question is, what you can't say, okay, human rights, then we have to wage a war in Afghanistan for 20 years because of women's rights. No, that doesn't make any sense because you look at the consequences. And the global consequences, not just on Afghanistan, but on the rest of the world, the money being spent on everything, the armaments and so on. And then, of course, that's roughly my way of thinking. But I don't have a very deep or original reflection on these things. But I tend to be very strongly consequent. I don't like, well, utilitarian, we can discuss whether it's happiness or freedom, but it's certainly consequentialist. I don't care about the intentions of people. I don't care what, I mean, of course, I can say if I was a judge, okay, then I would take care. I mean, did he kill this accidentally or did he mean to kill? Of course, I would ask that question. But I mean, when I look at the politicians and so on, I'm certainly convinced that many of them don't think it true, and they are convinced of their religion of human rights. But I think I don't care about that. I mean, I think it's their behavior is monstrous in many ways, and I look at consequences. So I don't care. I don't ask myself the question of intention. Many people judge the intention, and they think they have access to the intention of people, even though Putin wants this, Xi wants this, and so on. We don't have proofs of that. Okay, I mean the thing which I see are the consequences. In that sense, I pass for being very inhuman, which I don't think I am. I don't think I am, but people would think that I'm cold-blooded and so on because I don't. Oh, but he has good intention. You see, okay, maybe I just want to know what he does. Okay, but that creates a friction between me and many other people who don't like what I say because of you know for that reason, and especially when you are in this sort of religion of human rights, which is okay. It's really, for example, I don't know, in my country, for example, for a long time, and still when I was young, the dominant religion was Catholicism. And it was really quite something. The church, they were, of course, banning abortion and contraception and everything. But there was a secular movement against them all the time, ever since the country became independent. There was a liberal and socialist movement, and they were relatively secular. Of course, there was discussion about what it means, but there was a secular. But when it comes to the human rights, it's so overwhelming that there is there is no secularism. There is nobody who says, wait a minute, let's think about consequences. And it just doesn't exist. So it's and the Human Rights Organization, the GMO, not GMO, non-governmental organization, etc. These guys are like priests, and you can't criticize them. It's very difficult to criticize them. And for me, there is a very strong analogy, but as I say, without a secularism, except to some extent on the far right. But of course, I don't like them for other reasons, so I can't go along with them. But sometimes the far right, we don't want human rights because we don't want immigration or something like that. That, of course, sometimes sometimes they say correct things about these intervention and wars, but I don't like their.
Yeah, I mean, like I can see how people might read your reviews poorly, but I think any fair consideration, if someone reads the book, you're coming from a great place. Like any ideological commitment to intentions doesn't protect you from the responsibility of real consequences. Just because a party says it's all for human rights, that doesn't matter what it says it's for. It matters what it does. It matters what happens under its watch.
But you know very well that there is this very strong emphasis on I mean, there is a psychological, let's say, there is a psychological effect to CP. I mean, it's over and over and over again. When you have politicians, I mean, they can constantly say, we're going to bring you prosperity, we're going to bring you peace, we're going to bring you this and that. And then it's reflected by the media, and the whole, song and dance goes along with it, and intellectuals go along with that. And then it has a very strong effect. But after all, what did the church do for centuries? Been doing exactly the same thing. We are going to save you, and you're going to go to heaven, and God knows what. I mean, and so it has a very strong. I mean, I don't know exactly how the brain works, but certainly it's a very strong effect on the brain, on the psychology of people, forces them to think about, to accept the propaganda. Let's call it the propaganda.
Yeah. Did you just see this interview of John Bolton uh, the other day? John Bolton of
Yeah, I know him, but I'm not sure I saw that interview.
he was on CNN, I think, and either talking about Ukraine or January 6th, I forget what, but he intentionally, yeah, he basically admitted to planning coups around the world.
Yeah. I remember that. Yeah, of course. There's some. Yeah, sometimes there is the cynical guy who comes and says that. And I think when there was a coup in Bolivia, Musk said, yeah, they have to deal with the fact that we overthrow whoever we want. And they often, sometimes there is a cynical guy, but then of course the majority, which goes along with human rights, my God, it's really awful. No, we don't do that. We do that for democracy and human rights. We shouldn't think that, and we're far right and so on and so forth. But the results are the same. The results are the same, and I think the world would be much better if they were thinking about it. But it's impossible because it's sort of, as I say, it has the force of a religion, and a religion. I mean, what is remarkable, if you wish, in the 60s and 70s, is the fact that, of course, that also happened in the communist world, but in the West, religion was replaced by this, I mean, the traditional Christianity, let's say, because it's Christianity, was replaced by the human rights. Even I would say in countries like the United States, that for some reason have remained very Christian. Western Europe isn't very Christian. Well, it is maybe actually it's rising maybe, but the US is still very Christian. But nevertheless, I would say that the dominant ideology is not Christianity, but it's it's human rights. We're not going to say, oh, we have to send the Marines there because these guys don't believe in Jesus. No, we don't say that anymore.
Yeah, yeah. And then some people make the argument that it's like the hollowness of the how hollow these ideologies are that lead to internal trouble. That's what leads to destability and the entering of a strong man who tries to become an autocrat.
Yeah, that's what I call the barricade effect. The evolution of Russia, for example, toward the 90s, I thought, I mean, I was following, of course, what happened, and I thought it was absolutely, I could see that it was absolutely catastrophic under the Yeltsin years, and it was a collapse of life, I mean, increase of, alcohol, collapse of life expectancy like never before in peacetime, and one disaster after another. And then, of course, Putin came in, but Putin did improve the situation, and the Russians like him for, I mean, those who like him, but there's a substantial fraction who do like him, they like him for that reason, not just because he wants to reconstitute the Russian Empire and so on. I don't believe that that's what the main reason, but he did improve spectacularly the economic situation. I mean, I'm talking about before the current war. But I mean, there is no understanding of that at all in the West. There is not at all. They just fantasize the fact that it's a strong man. Why do they like a strong man? They like a strong man because they had a weak man before, and the weak man was, giving away everything to the Western powers.
I mean,
And how
even China, right? Like horrifying things about the Chinese regime, but it uplifted the most people out of poverty in human history.
of course, that's not something I found horrible at all. And people are unable to understand that. That, of course, makes the regime, if you want to call it like that, popular. And I mean, I think, of course, there is nothing deep or original in my argument about the barricade effect. And I say Russell was saying that already about the Russian Revolution, but the Soviet Revolution or the Bolshevik Revolution, but it's really very hard. I mean, you see, something I found, maybe that's what I think is important in ethics, is to be able to put yourself in the mind of others. Look at the world, try to understand the world as others sees it, other people, other countries. Everybody is anti-racist, okay? They're all saying, oh, racism is horrible, etc. But maybe the first thing that would be really anti-racist is to make the psychological effort to say, how would I look at things if I was Chinese? How would I look at the business of Taiwan if I was Chinese? How would I look at the situation in Ukraine if I was Russian and so on? And there is zero, I mean, now with the human rights and democracy, I mean, it's even worse than it used to be because, I mean, there is I mean, certainly, as I said, de Gaulle was certainly able to see these things, but even President Chirac in France, he did. I mean, of course, he as I say, it was not for censorship, but he wasn't gung ho about Salman Rushdie as we are now. Now we're all going to this one guy. Of course, it's criminal what he does, but this one guy, and now everybody is writing things about Islam it's Islam which is a danger and so on and so forth, and they don't define what they mean by Islamist, and then of course they don't realize that the fatwa was made by Shiites and Muslim in France are basically Sunni, and I mean just unbelievable. And they can't. I mean, Sharek was saying, you shouldn't insult. Well, I don't agree with that. I'm again more against censorship than he is, but he says you shouldn't. You should understand that people are hurt in their deepest feeling, and there's no feeling about that at all. You say that, then you justify murder and so on. No, no, we don't justify anything, but we just want to avoid violence by useless provocation. They do these cartoons, and they're very happy about their cartoons, and of course they can do them, but they're also anti-Jewish cartoons in some far right, and then these people are taken to court. So I mean, you have to know what you want. I mean, if you use the anti-racist laws in one situation, but then of course not in the other, and you say, well, this is just criticism of religion. It's not criticism of religion, just making fun of the believers in a way which is very vulgar. As I say, I'm completely atheist, and I was atheist in a Catholic university, and I've written articles about religion. There's nothing, there is no ambiguity there. But of course, that's arguing. It's not the same thing as ridiculing people as they do all the time.
Agree. There's a huge difference. I mean, I think part of the American imagination might have been woken up to that, like towards empathizing with your opponent during the Trump years, in that a lot of liberals woke up and saw that half the country had voted for this person, so you couldn't hate half the country. You had to try to empathize with them to some extent. Wasn't too successful, but that courtesy certainly hasn't been extended beyond America's borders.
Yes, I don't see that at all. The reaction of liberals seems to be that this is a bunch of morons and they don't understand anything. It seems to me that they have no. That's one of the reasons why Hillary lost when she was, the deplorable and so on. I mean, they seem to have no understanding whatsoever for their own population. Now we are talking about the Chinese and the Russians and the Arabs and so on. No, no, we're talking about the the American population. It seems to me that the reason the country is so polarized is that because on the one hand there are these very well-meaning and arrogant, I would say, liberals who despise, of course, the other countries, the other people, but then, of course, almost half of their own population. And then, of course, the other people, they don't have any. You see, it's not that I like the others because I think the others are confused to the extreme, but I understand their resentment. You see, I understand their grief and their fury at seeing these liberal elites being too indifferent to their situation, because the deindustrialization has been changing your status from working in an industry where you could have good wages, you could be unionized, etc., to working at Walmart is a big change in the life of many people. And then I think this has been a real problem for lots of people. And then they are furious at that, and they have reasons to be. And there is zero, as far as I can see, zero understanding on the side of the liberals. The liberals are creating a lot of problems for themselves because you see, they violate many classical liberal ideas. One is, of course, peace, and of course, mutual understanding, which is a liberal value. Another, of course, is free speech, because they are now resorting to all kinds of censorship through big tech in order to suppress views that they don't like. And that's sort of, the liberals are becoming less and less liberal, in the good sense of the word liberal, classical liberalism, and they still claim to be liberals, but it's
Yeah, they're becoming more symbolic in a sense, and only symbolic.
yeah, they claim to be. I don't agree with their version of liberalism, and also they are for democracy. But then, as I say, is it democratic to have 300 million people who are not even really represented by these policies? But no, even if were run, guide billion of them. I mean, just doesn't make any. this everything is screwed up there, and they. Maybe I should write another follow-up to my book, which is about how liberals are sort of undermining themselves by not being liberal in the good sense of the word.
Yeah, future looks pessimistic.
I don't know. I don't have any. I don't know. I don't know. I don't know because it depends on all kinds of factors, and I just don't know. I don't want to.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, I think predicting the future has been always wrong. So you see, in the 60s and the 70s, people thought there was a wave of revolution. And then in the 80s came, Thatcher, Reagan, and became a sort of counter-revolution. But then after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was this end of history idea that now, exactly what they still think that liberal, so-called capitalism and liberalism run for forever. But of course, September 11 was already a problem for that because it showed that not everybody was. I mean, I don't go into conspiracy theories. I think there was a real attack on the World Trade Center, but then of course that showed that there was. I mean, the fact that some people were happy about it. I mean, there were testimonies that people were thought that the Americans finally taste their own medicine. Not me, not me, not me. I remember the very day that happened. I said, think of, some people were happy. I said, think about the hundreds of thousands of people they're going to kill when they take their revenge. And that's exactly what happened. So I was not guilty of being happy about that. But it showed that there was a disagreement. And then, of course, now what's happening, not so much with the war in Ukraine, but the fact that the rest of the world does not go along with American sanctions, which is something that I was totally surprised because, of course, it's a violation of international law, and the rest of the world usually defends international law. But they find the US so hypocritical that many countries, including India and other, don't go, African countries, and don't go along with the Americans by taking sanctions. And I was very surprised, but that's a fact, and that shows again that there is a total mismatch between the reality of what people think in the world and what the American intellectuals imagine in their head.
Yeah. Very principally, predicting is very difficult. This is something Chomsky is very clear about, right? That you can't predict human affairs, you can understand them to some extent.
Yeah, because as I say, I mean, this idea that now we are at the end of history. I think that at that time in 2001, I wrote an article, the end of history. But now I think the end of history is really completely finished with the war in Ukraine. Everything was going on, and the the fact that the Chinese are furious. I mean, it really takes some genius, because you really need to be run by geniuses to produce the result they produce. Because I've been in the Soviet Union and in China in the 80s. And there you could see that as a reaction to communism or to, there was a lot of pro-Western sentiment. And in fact, I think of Western, wrong, I mean, mistaken ideas. They were idealizing the West, like people on the other side might have been idealizing communism, they were idealizing the West. Okay. But then when the thing fell or things changed, the Chinese were suddenly a very goodwill to a good relation with the West. And then, of course, you had not Putin, you had Yeltsin, who was a total servant of the West, okay? And it takes some genius to change the mentality of those people and make them into enemies, which is exactly what the Americans and the Europeans were able to do. And they are doing it even more now. If they make a ban again, they won't do it. Apparently, the Germans don't want. But if they make a ban, they talk of a ban against all Russians citizens to travel. I mean, it means independently of their wealth, independent. I mean, first they started, well, we're going to sanction the oligarchs. Putin doesn't care that much about the oligarchs, but I think they're all his friends. Okay, so and then now they go to all citizens, irrespective of their views. There is a substantial fraction of Russian citizens who are opposed to the policy of Russia. So I mean, they will make themselves hated even more. That's even talking about it, even considering that, which is against all their principles, is something which is of course going to make themselves even more hated in Russia and indirectly in the rest of the world. So they're completely crazy. And it takes, as I say, it took a certain amount of geniuses to alienate the Russian and the Chinese the way they did, given the pro-Western sentiment that existed at the end of the 1980s.
The original end of history idea, which I think comes out of Hegel, was that there won't be system change anymore. That the means of economic systems are pretty much set. That there isn't a next step. Um, I don't know if I believe in that, but I certainly don't believe in the idea that there won't be conflict. That there won't be.
No, of course, that was the idea of the clash of civilization, to say that there's still conflict of civilization, which is more or less what's happening. But I don't believe in anything. I mean, I just say that. I mean, when I was young, I mean, not everywhere, but there were, there were the all the anti-colonial struggle. There was the Vietnam War, etc. And then there was this idea that the world is changing, but there is revolution going on. And then after it was counter-revolution, and then it was the end of history, and now history is starting again. Where it's going to lead, I don't know.